Okay, now I'm going to start with, this is going to be lesson 4 in your ALEKS assignments. This is absolute value equations. So let's talk about when you first learned absolute value. You would just learn, just doing it for just numbers. And when you learned it, you learned that the definition for the absolute value is the distance from 0 on the number line. That's because it doesn't matter if the number is negative or positive, it's still the non-negative number of whatever you're talking about. So like if it's negative 5, it's 5 from 0 on the number line. If it's positive 5, it's still 5 from 0 on the number line. So we say that it's the non-negative form of the number. So now let's look at that in terms of an equation. So if I have this equation, so you remember those rules. The absolute value can either be a negative or a positive because then it's always the non-negative version of it. So when we have an equation, we can set up two forms of the equation because the absolute value of 2x could be negative 10 or it could be positive 10. Either one. So now we can solve for these two equations. So we would divide by 2 and then x is negative 5. Or we would divide by 2 over here, and x could be positive 5. Now, another thing that you always have to do with absolute values is you have to check your solutions. Because then, if sometimes you think you have two solutions, but one won't work. So what we do is we go back to the original equation, and we check. Would it make that equation true if I put either a negative 5 or a positive 5 in there? So that would be negative 10. And then the absolute value of negative 10 is 10. So that one, negative 5, is a solution. The next one was the positive 5. So now we do 10. And then the absolute value of 10 is 10. So both solutions worked. Okay, let's look at another example. So this time we're going to have one step that we have to do before we can make our two equations. The absolute value of 4x plus 6 minus 57 equals negative 15. Okay, so what we have here is we have a constant here. Before we have, it's in the way before we can do our two equations. It needs to be moved because before we can set our two possible equations for our absolute value, the absolute value has to be isolated. So since we have a minus 57 here, we need to subtract it off to the other side. So those are gone. So now we're left with what we want. We want an isolated absolute value, and then that'll be 42. And so now you can set your two possible equations. So remember, it can either be a negative 42, or the absolute value of that or what's in the absolute value can be a positive 42. So there's your two equations. So now we have two step equations. So we're going to subtract our constant first for x. That's going to be negative 48. And then let's go ahead and finish this one off. Divide, so that's going to be negative 12. Or remember, it's one or the other, or both. So this one, subtract 6. 4x equals 36. And then divide off our coefficient. X equals 9. So again, one or the other. Which one is true, or are they both true? So you go back to your original. Remember, the original before you moved anything. And you put in, whoops, you need to put in, and I didn't. Put in your solution, so negative 12 on that side. And then this side, I'm going to do 9 in my solution. Okay, so did they both work? So now we work it out. 4 times negative 12 is negative 48 plus 6. Negative 48 plus 6 is negative 42. And then That's the absolute value of negative 42. So that's going to be just 42 minus 57. And then 42 minus 57 is 15. Is negative 15, sorry. Because 57 was the bigger number. So negative 12 is the solution. So now we check 9. So that's 4 times 9, 36. 36 plus 6 is 42. And then the absolute value is just 42. We're going to go ahead and then subtract, and again, negative 15. So both solutions worked. Okay, so we're going to look at one more. Absolute value. This time, we're going to look at when you can get a no solution. So remember, the first thing you got to check, is my absolute value isolated? This one is not. We've got to isolate it. So we're going to divide. That's a coefficient, or that's multiplied, however you want to look at it. You got to divide by it. So now we've got the absolute value of 2x plus 7, and then 6 divided by negative 3 is negative 2. Well, there's a problem here. Remember, we talked about the absolute value is the non-negative, which in turn is a negative or positive. But you can't start with a negative. So this one is actually a no solution. You can't do anything else with this one. And that's our absolute value equations. That's how they work. So I'm going to stop this video, and our last video will be inequalities and compound inequalities.